Hi everybody, my name is Mitchell Farmer and this is part 2 of MSK Lab 8, going over the anterior compartment of the forearm. So before diving into the anterior and posterior compartments of the forearm, I want to talk about some terminology real quick. So basically there's terminologies like Carpi. So Carpi is when the attachment of muscle tendons onto the wrist or just distal to it. Motion provided by these muscles will move the hand at the carpal joint. So if something has carpi in it, that means that it attaches to the wrist or just distal to it. If something has pollicis in it, for example abductor pollicis brevis, that means that it attaches to the thumb. Motions of these muscles will move the thumb in various directions. Muscles that have digitorum in it means that the muscle tendons attach onto the middle or distal phalanges of the digits 2 through 5 and will provide movement in those digits, so everything but the thumb. And then finally, if it has the word minimi in it, like Flexor Digiti Minimi, that means that it's attaching to digit 5, the little finger, and will thus move the little finger. Now this is going to be important because I'm going to approach part 2 of this lab a little differently than I've done most other MSK ones. There is an extremely large number of muscles to deal with, and so I'm not going to necessarily talk about the proximal and distal attachment of every one, because more often than not it's in the name. Like there's no need for me to say that flexor carpi radialis attaches to a carpal bone because it has the word carpi in it, and so you should know that. Okay? So on that note, I'm going to dive into the anterior compartment, starting with flexor carpi radialis. Just a note on the anterior compartment of the forearm, it is innervated entirely by the median nerve, with the exception of just a few muscles, which I will note, that are innervated by the ulnar nerve. But if I don't say what nerve innervates the muscle, assume it's the median. Furthermore, I'm going to start with the superficial compartment. So the anterior compartment of the forearm is split into superficial and deep. I'm going to start with the superficial compartment, which all originate on the medial epicondyle of the humerus. So you can see how all of these come together and all come off the same medial epicondyle. And that's going to be important because that is also why you get, say, golfer's elbow or something if you have a inflammation of this common tendon on the medial epicondyle of the humerus. So, starting with flexor carpi radialis, it is a wrist flexor on the radial side. I'm going to go over some movements here just so you have an idea of what I'm talking about when I say wrist flexion and stuff like that. So, here is the action of wrist flexion right here. And as you can see, the muscles that perform wrist flexion are primarily in the anterior compartment, which is why it's also often known as the flexor compartment. Okay, so flexor carpi radialis aids in wrist flexion, and it's on the radial side. And I'm going to hide that now, and I'm going to show you flexi carpi ulnaris, which is basically provides or does the exact same thing except is on the ulnar side, but this is one of two exceptions. It's innervated by the ulnar nerve. Super easy to remember. Has the word ulnaris in its name, innervated by the ulnar nerve as opposed to the median. I'm going to hide that. Then if we look superiorly, we have pronator teres. So pronator teres, unsurprisingly, aids in pronation of the forearm, which I can show you. Along with, and that's kind of as the radius, turns over the ulna medially in this action. So the quadratus, the pronator quadratus and pronator teres are what's responsible for pronation of the forearm above the elbow joint. So I'll exit out of that, exit out of this. I'm going to hide pronator teres. Okay, so onto this big guy, Flexor Digitorum Superficialis. By the name, you should know that it flexes the digits, that being digit 2 through 5, and it's superficial to Flexor Digitorum Profundus, which is deep. So each tendon attaches respectively to the base of the middle phalanx of digits 2 through 5. So highlighted here is the middle phalanx. I'm sorry, highlighted here is the middle phalanx. And you can see it attaches to the base of that. So I guess one other thing worth note with the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis is it has two heads. One arises from the medial epicondyle, as previously discussed, where most of them arise from the medial epicondyle. And then the other arise from the shaft of the radius. So you can see the radius here, and you can see how it comes off the shaft of the radius, this being the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis. And you can also see how the median and the ulnar artery pass beneath the fibrous arch linking the two heads. So this is the fibrous arch. I'm just going to get rid of Pollicis longus here. This is the fibrous arch that goes between the two heads, and you can see the ulnar artery passing deep to it. And similarly, the median nerve, ulnar artery, median nerve passing below that fibrous arch, all right? So now I'm going to hide Flexor Digitorum Superficialis, as well as the median nerve. So then there is Brachioradialis, which is the most lateral muscle found in the anterior aspect of the forearm. It crosses the elbow, which means it causes movement on the plane of the elbow. And what it does is elbow flexion, but it does this best when you're in the thumbs up position. So when you're kind of partially pronated. Okay, so I'm going to hide that. And now I'm going to move on to talk a bit about the deep flexor compartment on your left of the model's right after hiding this. So the deep flexor compartment is innervated by the median nerve, like the superficial flexor compartment, but it's innervated by a specific branch of the median nerve known as the anterior osseous or anterior interosseous nerve. So that's all the deep muscles. So there's the Flexor Digitorum profundus, profundus being deep to superficialis, and the Flexor Digitorum profundus attaches to the distal phalanx of the digits 2 through 5, as opposed to the middle phalanx seen in the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis. Unsurprisingly, it flexes the fingers. I'll show that to you really quickly, just so you have an idea what that looks like. So this finger flexion, performed by profundus, and then superficial to that, Flexor Digitorum Superficialis. And as you can see, it's digits 2 through 5, and not the digit 1, the pollex or the thumb. X out of that. Next I want to talk about was Flexor Pollicis longus. So it originates from the radius, the mid shaft of the radius, and inserts into the distal phalanx of the thumb, seen here. And it flexes the thumb. And then finally there is pronator quadratus, seen distally, going from the radius to the ulna. And I already showed you how that aids in pronation of the forearm. The last thing I wanted to point out on the model's right hand side is the Flexor Retinaculum, which is a very clinically important tendon or retinaculum, because it helps create what's known as the carpal tunnel. And the carpal tunnel encloses the Flexor Digitorum profundus tendons and the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis tendons, which I've taken out, as well as the Flexor Pollicis longus tendons. And extremely importantly, the median nerve. And so when people have that numbness in their hand, that is from compression of the median nerve when you have inflammation within that canal formed by the Flexor Retinaculum. And you guys are going to do carpal tunnel release probably again this year, and so you'll have the opportunity to see exactly what that anatomy entails. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick overview of the forearm blood supply before diving into the posterior compartment of the forearm to finish this off. All right. So I'm going to start you off with the radial artery. The radial artery and the ulnar artery, highlighted here, are branches of the brachial artery and the cubital fossa, which is the area that you can kind of palpate the brachial artery in clinically. The radial artery travels along the lateral aspect of the forearm, deep to the brachioradialis, which I've removed or else we wouldn't be able to see it. And then it passes through the anatomical snuff box, kind of around the base of your thumb. You can look at it by abducting your thumb outwards. And then it pierces the first interosseous muscle between the first and second metacarpal to contribute to the deep palmar arch, which we can only see kind of just a little bit in here. So that's the radial artery. And it also sends branches to the posterior aspect of the hand. So this is the radial, highlighted here, to the posterior aspect of the hand to help supply blood there as well. So now if we come back up and have a look at the ulnar artery. So shortly after splitting from the brachial artery, the ulnar artery gives off the common interosseous artery, which then quickly branches off into the anterior and posterior interosseous arteries. These two arteries travel along the anterior and posterior aspect of the interosseous membrane extending between the radius and the ulna. The anterior interosseous is accompanied by the anterior interosseous nerve, which supplies all the muscles of the deep compartment of the forearm, of the anterior forearm. And then coming back to the ulnar nerve, it enters the hands medially, and that's kind of, and then very similarly, it helps provide blood to the superficial arch and the deep arch. Okay, so now on to the posterior compartment of the forearm. Breaking out into a sweat here. The forearm anatomy is quite complicated, but we'll do our best. So, the first thing I want to talk about with the posterior compartment of the forearm is some of the anatomy of the radial nerve. Sorry, the radial nerve here. So I'm going to throw in all of that. I'm going to hide some stuff here. Okay. So the radial nerve arises from C5 to T1, as you might recall, arising from the posterior cord of the brachial plexus. And once it kind of gets to the cubital fossa, it breaks into or branches off into the superficial branch of the radial artery or radial nerve and the deep branch of the radial nerve. The deep branch then pierces the supinator muscle, which I will show you later. And as it pierces the supinator muscle, it changes, it's kind of highlighted here, and as it pierces it, it changes its name to the posterior interosseous nerve. Now the reason I'm bringing this up is because between the deep branch of the radial nerve and the posterior interosseous continuation of that deep branch, those guys innervate the whole rest of the muscles I'm going to be talking about for the posterior compartment and what I'm going to be calling the lateral wad. All right? So let's move on to some of the muscles proper. Take us to lateral aspect here. And I'm actually just going to pull back up this posterior forearm view. Okay, sorry to bounce around a bit on you there. So one thing to keep in mind in regards to the superficial muscles of the posterior compartment, and amongst those something known as the lateral wad, all these superficial muscles, are, with the exception of brachioradialis, arise from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus via the common extensor tendon. Okay? And that's very important. So in the superficial layer, the extensor carpi radialis brevis, the extensor digitorum, the extensor digiti minimi, all come off the common extensor tendon. And that's very important because that's going to provide what we see. And these are the muscles I'm talking about here. Sorry about that. All coming off that lateral epicondyle. And that's going to be important because you're going to get tennis elbow from this common tendon when it becomes inflamed. And the brachioradialis, instead of coming off that lateral epicondyle, comes off the proximal 2/3 of the supracondylar ridge. And also the extensor carpi radialis longus comes off that proximal area as well, and not the epicondyle as seen with all of these muscles. So those two guys don't, but the rest of them do. All right, so starting with the lateral, or also known as the mobile wad, I'm going to start you off with the brachioradialis muscle. So the brachioradialis muscle, as you can see, it sits anteriorly and it acts as a flexor. But the reason I've thrown it into this section is because it's innervated by the radial nerve. So unlike the rest of the muscles that act as a flexor and sit anteriorly, that are innervated by the median nerve and occasionally the ulnar, this is innervated by the radial nerve. So keep that in mind. And as previously stated, it flexes the elbow mostly when you're in the thumbs up position, so kind of like mid pronation. So now I'm going to hide that and go on to the extensor carpi radialis longus. So unsurprisingly, its distal attachment is the carpal bones, and so it's going to extend the wrist. It's all in the name, right? And as previously stated, it doesn't arrive from that lateral epicondyle. Instead, it arrives more proximal. And just to be specific, it inserts onto the posterior aspect of the second metacarpal. If I turn posteriorly and zoom in, that can kind of be seen, but it's kind of obscured by a lot of tendons and muscles and very complex hand anatomy. But just keep that in mind. So I'm going to hide that, and then we can discuss the extensor carpi radialis brevis. So this also extends the hand at the wrist joint, just like longus, but instead it inserts onto the posterior aspect of the third metacarpal. So here's a metacarpal, the third metacarpal, and here is extensor carpi radialis brevis inserting onto it. I'm going to hide that now. So those muscles make up the lateral or mobile wad, the brachioradialis, extensor carpi radialis longus, and brevis. Now, to get on to the posterior extensor compartment. So on the model's right is going to be the deep muscles of that compartment, and on the model's left is going to be the superficial muscles. All superficial muscles come off of the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. So the first thing I'm going to discuss is the extensor digitorum, because it's probably the most prominent muscle, and it's the main extensors of the fingers, that being digit 2 through digit 5, not the thumb, and its 4 tendons insert into the posterior aspect of the bases of the middle and distal phalanges. So you can see how it has a tendon here and then another set of tendons that attach distally and in the middle. And so with those tendons, it allows for hand extension, seen like so. And I'm highlighting it here. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to hide that, and we can have a look at Extensor Digiti Minimi, which lies between the Extensor Digitorum and the Extensor Carpi Ulnaris. So Extensor Digiti Minimi, it inserts into the base of the distal phalanx of the 5th digit. So the 5th digit being the little finger or pinky finger, it inserts into the base of that 5th digit, and it allows for extension of that 5th digit. And I guess worthwhile noting, these muscles are all going underneath the extensor retinaculum, which, like the flexor retinaculum, prevents bowstringing of the tendons when they contract. Now, if we continue from lateral to medial, we come across the extensor carpi ulnaris. So the extensor carpi ulnaris aids in extension of the wrist, and it attaches to one of the carpal bones, as in its name. I'll show you wrist extension really quickly. So that's wrist extension. That's returning to neutral. And then flexion. And then wrist extension. Okay? All right. So finally, we can come to the deep compartment of the extensor compartment, or the posterior compartment. So the deep portion of that. So that consists of the supinator muscle. So recall the supinator muscle is the muscle that when the deep branch of the radial nerve pierces it, it then becomes the posterior interosseous nerve, highlighted here. And the supinator muscle, unsurprisingly, aids in supination of the arm along with the biceps tendon. If we continue inferiorly, we come across, distally, we come across the abductor pollicis longus. The abductor pollicis longus aids in abduction of the thumb, and I will show you it originates from the about the middle third of the ulnar bone. And if I take us to that view where I can show you the hammer mode, I guess I've been calling it, I can show you thumb extension. So it aids in thumb extension, and it aids in abduction of the thumb as well. So then if we continue distally, we can then come across the extensor pollicis longus, also arising from about the middle third of the ulnar bone. The abductor pollicis longus, then the extensor pollicis longus. And then if we continue, we come across the extensor indicis, which is just on the second digit index finger and aids in extension of that. And that's the deep compartment, those three muscles along with the supinator. What they do is basically in the name, we have the abductor of the thumb, the extender of the thumb, and then the second digit gets its own special extensor as well. Okay, so I know that was a bit fuzzy and a little bit more rushed than usual, but forearm anatomy is really complicated. I encourage you to review it as much as you have time to, so that you get a good grasp on it. I will see you for the next video.